I'm a 21-year-old woman, and this happened to me a few years ago while I was working. I was working at a well-known Mexican restaurant chain across the country as a delivery driver. The restaurant was always busy every day, which meant I was constantly making deliveries. Things wouldn't start to settle down until at least an hour before closing, so it was chaotic, to say the least. One night, my boss called me on my day off, asking if I could come in, since someone had called in sick. Since I wasn't really busy that night, I figured why not, and drove over to work. The moment I arrived, I clocked in. My shift went as usual, but toward the end, our phone rang with a man's voice placing a large order for tacos and burritos. However, the second he realized I was a woman, the tone in his voice changed completely in a kind of flirtatious way. He gave me his address and told me how he wanted the food dropped off. I told my coworker that he needed one large order and to hand it to me when it was ready. That's when I noticed the order was barely within our delivery radius, and I even asked my boss if it was still worth taking. I could tell my boss was in a bit of a hurry and didn't have time for questions or concerns, so I chose to just do it anyway. I entered the guy's address in Google Maps and headed out, hoping this would be my last delivery for the night. And it would be, for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't too far away after all, but that's when I realized the area I was in was pretty empty. It was a small cabin in the woods, just outside of town, where cell reception was barely available. Being a small, petite college girl, it was scary being out here alone, as it was completely cut off. It was definitely sketchy, but I knew I could finally go home once I finished the delivery. I pulled up to the cabin that Google Maps led me to, and immediately noticed there were no cars in the driveway. However, a single light was on, meaning someone was definitely home. It looked like one of those hunting cabins, small, but big enough to fit a few people comfortably. Anyway, I stepped out of the car with the food in hand and knocked on the door since there was no doorbell. Within a minute, the door opened, and I was met by a man who seemed to be in his mid-30s. He was wearing only his tidy whities. He was tall and extremely overweight. He was bald, and honestly, he smelled like he hadn't showered in days. He greeted me, introducing himself as Jacob, and immediately snatched the food from my hands. He opened the bag, looked back at me with a smile, and said he wouldn't be able to eat all this food alone, asking if I'd mind coming inside to share. I laughed uncomfortably, then politely declined, and looked at his large frame, thinking to myself, he could definitely finish the entire order himself. I wasn't about to stick around with a half-naked creep. This time, in a firmer tone, I told him that I had to go, and started backing away toward my car. As I turned to leave, he shouted that he forgot my tip. He went inside for a moment, and came back with his fist clenched around some bills, reaching his arm toward me. I hesitantly put out my hand, and as he opened his fist above it, I saw it was just a crumpled $1 bill, so I quickly pulled my hand back, letting the bill fall to the ground. Now, this is where things really took a turn for the worst. As I started to hurry back to my car, I heard, clear as day, a loud scream coming from the back of the cabin. He looked toward the back of his cabin, then back at me. That's when his whole attitude completely changed. This time, with a panicked look, he lunged forward and tried to grab my arm. I felt terrified and jumped back, running to my car and pulling out of his driveway, not looking back. I called my boss from the car, barely able to speak through my panic. He told me to return immediately and that he'd call the police. When I got back, the police were already there with my boss. After answering their questions and giving them the address, I didn't hear anything for a few days. Turns out the man who I had made the delivery to was holding a woman captive at the cabin. The woman screaming was another delivery driver who worked at the pizza place across the road and down the street from our restaurant. Police discovered he didn't even own the cabin. It was a vacant holiday cabin he'd broken into days earlier. The woman had delivered to a different vacant cabin nearby when he abducted her, which is why the police weren't able to find her there. The part that disturbed me the most was that he had beaten her numerous times and kept her tied up. She had been in this cabin for days, and he wouldn't let her leave. He was obviously arrested, and the woman was taken to a hospital where she, thankfully, did survive. Looking back on it now, I realize he had tried to grab me, either to stop me from reporting the screams, or because he wanted to abduct me too. A few years back, I was at home with my young daughter one Friday night. I had weekend custody, so her mom had dropped her off earlier that day, and I was excited to spend time with her since I didn't get to see her often enough. It had been a long day of work, and I was happy to be back home and with my daughter. I lived in a smaller house that I was renting, which I moved to since the divorce. On this night, I ordered Chinese food because it's what my daughter wanted, and it was her favorite restaurant, and we had ordered from there many times without issue. My daughter was in the living room watching the news with me. Nothing out of the ordinary, just our usual dinner routine together. A little while later, the doorbell rang, and I knew it was the Chinese food. So I walked to the front door and opened it. A man was standing there with the Chinese food, and I took it from him, handing him his tip. Before I could close the door, though, the man asked if he could come in to use my bathroom. For some reason, I said yes. I didn't want the guy in my house because I didn't know him at all, plus my daughter was home with me, and obviously, I shouldn't have let him in. I don't really have an excuse or a reason, but I guess it was just instinct to be polite and say yes, so I did. The guy didn't immediately seem weird or anything, so I told him it was just down the hall, and to the right. The house wasn't that big, and it was pretty easy to figure out where everything was. So the guy walked down the hall and into the bathroom. I felt a little uneasy, because I didn't know him at all. But a couple of minutes later, he stepped out of the bathroom, and then headed back toward the front door. Then he left. After that, I was able to have my Chinese food with my daughter. However, several hours later, we were still awake. My daughter was in my bedroom, watching a show on the TV there, as a reward for her good grades. It was some TV show that a friend recommended to her, but I can't remember which show. At that time, I was relaxing in the living room, watching some highlights from the Aussie Formula 1 on my 60-inch TV. It was probably around 10 p.m. Suddenly, there was a knock at my front door. I had no idea who it could be at that hour. I certainly wasn't expecting anyone. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was the Chinese food delivery guy from earlier, but he wasn't wearing his uniform anymore. I opened up the front door and was really curious to see why he returned. The guy said he had just finished work and realized he had left his sunglasses inside my house. When he said this, immediately, I was suspicious. I couldn't even recall him wearing sunglasses when he dropped off the food. It was dark out at the time. He asked if he could come inside and search for them. At that point, I had been inside for a few hours and hadn't seen any sunglasses. Plus, I had been to the bathroom and never noticed them there either. I was absolutely certain that I would have. I told the man that I didn't think they were here, but I could do a quick check for him. He said no, he already knew where they were, and he was sure they were here. So I began to ask him where exactly, but then he just stepped straight inside my house. He said he'd only be a second. The man brushed past me and headed down the hallway. Then I watched him enter the hallway, but instead of going to the bathroom, he went into my daughter's bedroom, which was directly across from it. Luckily, my daughter was in my bedroom watching TV, and the bedroom door was closed, so he couldn't see or hear her in there. He then shut the door, and I heard it lock. I walked over there, and I heard him calling out for my daughter by name, telling her not to play hide and seek. Shocked, I told him that was not the bathroom. I know I was stating the obvious at that point, but I really was shocked and unsure what the hell was happening. But he didn't respond. By now, I had an awful feeling about this. I had no clue what was going on or what he was doing. I called out to him several more times, but he didn't say anything back. After a few more minutes of me being very confused, I decided to call the cops. I dialed 911 and explained the exact situation. Then I stood there waiting. I went near the front door of the house and did not want to go near my daughter's bedroom. I made sure my daughter stayed safe in my bedroom with the door locked. The whole time the man stayed inside, and I didn't hear a sound from him. The cops arrived pretty fast, and I met them outside. Then they entered my house. Sometime later, they came out with the man. No surprise, they found him hiding in my daughter's bedroom, and he was refusing to leave. I honestly have no clue exactly what he was up to, but obviously nothing good. Later that night, my daughter mentioned something disturbing to me. She said that when the delivery man had walked past her in the living room on his way to the bathroom during his first visit, he had given her a creepy smile and winked at her. I used to deliver food for Grubhub, Ubereats, and DoorDash for some extra cash when I could find the energy. Mainly on the weekends, but sometimes when my college schedule allowed, weekdays too. I used to operate all the 3 apps at the same time, since it made me more efficient at maximizing cash, giving me more orders to pick from. One night I was out delivering. I believe it was a Sunday. I received an order through my Grubhub app for a delivery that was only about 8 miles away, and it was a $20 order, which was really good for my area, so I accepted it without giving it much thought. It was pretty dark when I arrived, so when I pulled into the driveway, I parked near the end and kept my headlights on to help me see. I knocked on the door and stood there, waiting for the customer to answer. On the Grubhub app, you can choose to have it handed to you or left at your door. In this particular order, they wanted it handed to them. I waited for about 30 seconds. I gave the door another polite, but slightly louder knock than my first attempt, and almost as soon as I did, I got a message from the customer. They politely asked if I could meet them around the back, in the shed, to hand over their order, promising to add a $20 tip through the app. They explained they were in the middle of fixing their water heater in the shed and couldn't step away. Right away I got a terrible feeling about it, but I didn't know what else to do, and I saw they had already added the extra tip to my order, which made it seem more legit. Plus, I could always use the extra money. So, I ended up doing the dumbest thing possible, and once again, against my gut, I just texted him back, saying that I would. I started walking toward the back to go find the shed, and it was even darker back there than it was out front. I began to feel a rush of adrenaline and some heavy anxiety, so I decided to turn around. It felt like I didn't even have a choice. It was that dark that I could barely see my own hand right in front of my face. So I got the hell out of there and did a light jog back to my car. As I was getting closer to my car, I heard a man yelling from behind me in the backyard, telling me to wait, saying he was nearby and to come back. I didn't even turn around to look. I just got into my car and I sped off. It's a good thing I did because as I was leaving, I saw 2 more grown men rush out of the shed, and all of them had ski masks on. I could hardly believe what was happening. It was pure luck that I decided to turn around when I did. I know exactly what would have happened if I hadn't, or if I had stayed even just a minute longer. I probably wouldn't be here right now to tell this story. Of course, I reported it to Grubhub and called the cops. I was keen to hear what the cops had to say, as I waited multiple days for them to get back to me, but deep down, I knew they were probably already gone by the time the police arrived. And I was correct about that. Since I never got a clear view of their faces, and because they were all wearing ski masks, I had no way of identifying any of them. There weren't any cars in the driveway either, so I had nothing to go off of. My only hope was Grubhub. Grubhub had to have one of their credit card numbers saved, since that's the only way they could have placed the order. But they didn't help much either. They basically told me to forget about it when I asked for answers. That house was empty, by the way. Nobody lives there, and it's been abandoned for almost 7 years. That's why it was so dark and spooky looking. It would be the perfect spot to pull off a crime, like kidnapping a young girl like me, or anything else I don't even want to think about. I still get chills when I think about it. I hope this makes people more aware, because stuff like this can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any moment. All you can do is stay ready, trust your gut, and take my bad decision-making as a tough life lesson, just like I had to.